Hi, I'm JD and welcome back to my channel. Today I am talking about how to read more books in 2023. So in my last video, I talked about my reading journal and how I had really kind of gotten into the groove of reading at the end of last year, even though I was not recording what books I was reading. I was finding a lot of ways to fit reading in, even though my schedule was busy. Busy with kids, busy with the holidays, managing my health, managing a household. But I do enjoy reading. I find it very stress relieving. Makes me think of the reel where it's like, oh, reading is so relaxing, and then they hurl the book across the room. But I do like reading, and I love reading good books. So I want to share my tips with how I found to read more books so that way you can read more books in 2023. My biggest tip is to schedule your reading time. Make an appointment with yourself on your calendar to read more. So for me, that looks like when I make it a part of my routines in the morning and the evening to read. It's part of my morning routine to read my daily Stoic and my current nonfiction read for 5-10 minutes each morning as part of my routine. And then before I go to bed, the last thing I do is I have my Kindle and I'm reading anywhere from 5 to 15-20 minutes before bed as well with my Kindle. So I make it a part of my routine. I also schedule in reading days, and this tends to happen more when I am beta reading a book, like a whole book for somebody, but I will also schedule a whole reading day for like a day after my infusion, or my big low energy days that I know are coming up, days where I know I'm not going to feel well. And that really helps as well. And I will just like, okay, I'm just going to clear my calendar. This is just going to be a reading day. That's going to be, that is my goal today, is to get through like this book or these two books, just depending on how I'm feeling. So I schedule it. The next thing I do to help me read more is to have e-reader apps on my phone and my tablet, any of my devices that I tend to carry with me and not leave the house. Like, I have to have them with me when I leave the house. This really helps because if I get stuck somewhere without my physical book that I'm currently reading, I always have access to, say, my Kindle library or the library ebooks. So if I get stuck in, say, a 20-minute line waiting for a register at Target, I can sit there and instead of scrolling on Instagram or scrolling through YouTube, I can scroll through a new book, or I can read a few more chapters. That's one of the things I really like about having a Kindle and their Whisper Sync program, is even if I'm listening to the book on audio in the car, I can then still pull up the book on my phone through the app and it will sync to where I was listening to it. And then when I get home in bed at night and I open my Kindle and I'm reading with my Paperwhite, it will then sync again to where I had last opened the book earlier in the day. So that's very helpful, especially when you're reading on multiple platforms and whatnot. So if I get stuck in a waiting room or at a kid's activity and I'm not going to try and do work, or I'm just trying to kill some time, I will try to reach for my phone and my e-reader rather than scrolling. And then this next tip kind of goes hand in hand with that. I read multiple books at once. So like I said, I'm reading a couple of nonfiction books first thing in the morning. I usually have at least one fiction book that I'm reading, if not two. At the moment, I'm only reading one, but it's because it's so good. And I'm like, I want to get to the end of it. So I'm trying to focus more on reading that and finishing it. So reading more than one book is helpful. I find that I read more when I try not to focus on reading one book at a time and like reading it start to finish before starting a new one, because instead of like, oh, this one sounds good, and I get a few pages in and I'm like, oh, it's not really gripping me, instead of forcing myself to get through it and wasting time avoiding reading my book, I just shelve it. There's a lot of these books that I've read like a couple of pages in, and I just leave my bookmark in it and I put it on the shelf. I mean, even if it's not gripping me right now, I can still come back to it later. It just means it's not the right time for me to read it at the moment. The next tip I have for you is audiobooks. I mentioned this earlier with the Whisper Sync, but I also like listening to audiobooks when I am doing something that keeps my body engaged, but not necessarily my mind. So when I'm driving, I like to listen to music in the car a lot, but if I'm going on a long road trip or I'm in the car for at least 30 minutes, I will put a book on to listen to. Or if I'm cooking in the kitchen, I will sometimes, if it's a recipe I really know well, I will sometimes put an audiobook on to listen to. Or when I'm doing chores around the house, or if I'm going for a walk, I will put an earbud in with my story and go for a walk or get on the treadmill. So, but if I'm just sitting there listening to an audiobook, I can't do it because my mind will wander. But if I can keep my body busy while I'm listening, like even like doing crochet or knitting, that helps too, because it's keeping my fingers engaged while I'm listening. So I will do that when I'm doing other things. Listening, just having that ability to listen to books is a big help. The next thing, I feel like this might be a little controversial, but I count rereading old favorites as reading towards my reading goal. So if it's now only if I read it only once during the year. So actually, I've got a couple here. These 3 books, they're very well loved, as you can tell. They're, my paperback copies of Mercedes Lackey, the Last Harold Mage trilogy. These I will reread. These books I reread maybe once every couple of years. There was a couple of years where I read them like once a year. But I really love this author's Valdemar series, so I will constantly reread these, especially Danielle's story. Other favorites, I'm like trying to see. Hold Me Closer, Necromancer by Lish McBride. This book has a very special place in my heart because it's the only book I've ever read that I finished and then immediately turned to page 1 and started reading again, and read it twice in a row back to back. I love this book. It's so good, and I highly recommend, if you haven't read it, to read it. It's so funny. I think it's technically a YA. It might fall more under the new adult, but it's really good. So, but books like this where I love that I really like reading over and over again. J.R. Ward is another one of those authors that I will reread multiple times, especially Lover Unleashed, which is one of my favorites. I count those as my towards my reading goal if I read them just once during the year. So I count that towards my totals, but I will note that it is a reread versus a new read. Other than that, I really try to focus on, instead of scrolling Instagram and scrolling Facebook, to scroll through a book instead. But I want to know, do you have any other tips that you use to read more? I also like tracking in my habit tracker whether or not I've read that day, and I have 2 separate trackers, one for nonfiction and one for fiction. So yeah, so I want to know, do you have any tips for reading more throughout the year this year? If so, leave a comment down below, and yeah, I guess that's it for today. So I hope you guys have a great week, and I will catch you in my next video. Peace, love, and happy writing, y'all. Bye.